Hey, Little Rock, my name is Jamie Taylor, and I'm host of the Block Talk podcast, where we add value to your block of time by showcasing people here in Central Arkansas that add value to our community. About 4 years ago, we took a really big, brave step out and interviewed all of the candidates that were running for mayor of our great city. 4 years later, we've been asked to do the same thing, and it's been so exciting at such a poignant time to have conversations with each of your candidates for mayor. So I made this quick disclaimer before every episode of the podcast to remind you that I, as a host, am trying to do my best to bring value to you. And I thought, what better way than to have an open conversation with each of these candidates and allow them to express their views and opinions on the issues that are most important to you as voters. So that being said, I had an open conversation with each of these candidates and asked them the same set of questions, tried to allot them the same amount of time, and hope that you will enjoy the opportunity to get to know them and then to get out and vote. Remember, the most important thing you can do as a resident of the city of Little Rock is to pay attention and to take care of each other. Thank you for tuning in to the Block Talk podcast mayoral series, and we hope you can grab your coffee, get jacked up. It's time to get underway. All right, Little Rock, grab your coffee, get jacked up. It's time for another episode of the Block Talk. I'm Jamie Taylor, and I'm so excited to be here today with Mr. Greg Henderson. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. Well, I'm excited because we're here to talk about the Little Rock mayoral race, and that is something that you are quite busy with. So before we even get into that, let's start with you, who you are, what's your history in Little Rock, and what made you want to run for mayor?
Yeah. So, I grew up in Central Arkansas, which is, I think anybody around Central Arkansas kind of feels like Little Rock's a little bit of home. So you're always in and out. Even growing up in the outskirts. So, it's, as soon as I can get out of, living with my parents, I moved straight to Little Rock. So it's been a while here. It's funny because we're sitting here in Apogee, and entrepreneurship's a big part of kind of what I've always done and what I've always been a part of. And so for me, I came out of college, had done marketing and trying to, pay the bills to, make sure my student loans weren't too high all the way through college. Started working with several different small businesses, restaurants in particular, and helping them grow their marketing, build websites for them, enhance their digital presence when, a time in the early 2000s when digital presence wasn't that big of a thing. And so I worked through that and then didn't really want to get into marketing and business consulting. That wasn't my idea. I had a political science degree and wanted to go work for a couple of candidates. That didn't work out, as political things don't always. And I started working for, a local tech company here, spent a year there, and then went into working with manufacturers across the state. So, really from right out of college, I've been working with small businesses. The manufacturing companies, worked through Economic Development Council and, worked with small manufacturers, hoping to grow them, helping to improve their processes, things like that, doing a lot of business consulting, and finally went off on my own and started working with, created Rock City Eats, so my own little entrepreneurial effort, and the whole Rock City, sphere of things, which has turned into a whole lot. And then I, started doing commercial real estate about a year ago. So it's been fun.
That's so interesting to me, too, the mix, because I share not only your love for Little Rock, but the understanding of entrepreneurship, how that works. But then also it sounds like you're kind of sewing together the fabric of entrepreneurship and manufacturing, which are huge backbones to the community here in Central Arkansas and to Little Rock. But when it comes to how a city is run and how it operates, one of my big curiosities is sort of like, how does that all work? And if you are an uninformed voter, if you're a resident of Little Rock and you're not sure how the city's run, like, can you start with what's the difference between like what the mayor does, the city manager, and like the executive board, and sort of how that looks in Little Rock, how it's run and who makes decisions?
Yeah. And so Little Rock's kind of this weird hybrid model. I don't know if you're, familiar with it much, but it's this, there's really not many other models across the state that operate this way. I think there may be one, and then nationwide, we're in like the 5% category where there's just not that many, where we have a city manager and a mayor, and then a council or a board form of government, which is really no different than a council at the end of the day. Part of it is that, I did some research on this several years ago, trying to understand this hybrid form of government, and is it the best form of government for the city? Is it not? Typically what happens is you got cities that are smaller than about 50,000 seems to be the nice cutoff, and they tend to go with the city manager position. The idea is that there's such a small population in those cities that finding someone who has the executive credentials to actually run the city effectively gets pretty low. So typically they hire in a city manager, and so that's not an elected position. That's just a hired in executive position. So Bruce Moore is our city manager. He maintains a good list of the executive responsibilities for the city. He was hired in, even though we were well above that category of, and there's no like hard cut, there's a few cities that are larger than,
Well, in our
50,000.
population, closer to like 250,000, right? In Little Rock proper.
200,000, yeah. 203, I believe is the technical number. Okay. Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, we're well above that. And so most cities our size or larger, what you see as a mayor, because I mean, the idea is that, again, you have a population big enough to support, somebody that's within the city that can be elected, that has the executive credentials to actually run a city. Little Rock is weird in that, we started off with, we had a city manager for a while. The mayor was just sort of a part-time, figurehead. And then it transitioned into being a full-time mayor, and also having a full-time city manager. So essentially we have two directors. It'd be like having two presidents. So we've got two executive directors in City Hall, which creates a lot of conflict and creates a lot of responsibility issues. I think the benefit of having a mayor is that, that person is, they report to the people of Little Rock. I mean, people of Little Rock can vote them in, vote them out, things like that. The city manager is really responsible to the city board or the city council, in other cases of their city. So the city council, the city board is the one that hires the city manager and can fire them ultimately, things like that.
Are the board's positions appointed or are they elected?
They're elected. So, and again, this is a weird Little Rock thing that we have. As you'll find out that a lot of Little Rock
we have some nuances in Little Rock.
A lot of things are really, really, we do things our own way. We beat our own drum. So we've got 7 wards across the city, divided up equally. I forget the exact population. It's around, it's over 20,000 that each ward maintains, but they're divided up roughly equally, right around, the same number. There's a small window of variance that's allowed for it. It's redone just like congressional districts or just like, state legislative districts.
Yeah, where, just like when things fluctuate.
Yeah, whenever we get a new census in, right, they change up, they'll change up some lines, things like that. And so there's 7 of those, which is pretty typical in a city. The thing that's not typical is we also have 3 at-large positions, and they're just elected citywide. And so that's been kind of a point of conflict for a while is do these 3 positions actually represent the city, or do they just represent the people who have a lot of money and can get somebody elected into something like that? So that's, it's a big point of contention. I would say that I think that the city would probably be better served by reevaluating that, looking to see do we really need these 3 at-large positions? There's been a couple models proposed. There's this sort of super ward idea where they each encompass about 2.5 wards each, kind of divide the city up and goes across wards. There's been proposals on just eliminating them. There's been proposals on going to 10 city wards. But I think that at some point in probably the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to have to sit down and look at, this is probably, our form of government's probably not going to work forever. Having 2 executives, having these, almost pseudo mayors in, the at-large positions to where, they're elected the same as the mayor. And I ran in 2020 against Joan Adcock, who is also, who is a citywide, at-large director. And I mean, that was one of the things I wanted to do then was I wanted to get in that seat intentionally to, get rid of the citywide positions because I thought that, that was probably not the best for the city, but you're never going to get the votes unless somebody on the board actually wants to vote against it.
Well, and it's interesting to kind of look at that because when I first did these interviews 4 years ago when Frank Warwick and Baker were running, I really had I moved to Little Rock. I'm originally from Southern California. So my ideas and sort of what I was used to is very different, kind of shaken up. And so that was my first exposure to Little Rock and kind of how it was run. And then over the last few years, I've sort of tried to become more familiar with it so that I can really understand and that we can use this platform to engage people to really kind of understand how Little Rock works. But when you talk about population, that makes me want to talk about population growth because that's our goal. And so maybe when I said 250,000, I was projecting. But
we'll get there someday.
Yeah. And so what's your goal or what would your administration's goal be with respect to population growth? And like, how would you determine methods in which to execute on that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, population growth, I mean, you can just like working with businesses. I mean, one of the things that I started helping businesses with was that there is the opportunity to grow too fast. there were a couple of times where we would, consult with a business, get them a lot of traffic. And what we realized was that whenever all those people came in and all those customers came in, their processes couldn't handle it.
Yeah, infrastructure.
And so, I mean, I've seen companies, not that I've done personally, let's say that, but I've seen companies tank because they get too many customers in and can't handle it. The same thing can happen for a city. I mean, we need to have strategic growth, and we need to strategically plan how we're going to grow, what areas we're going to grow, and what that population is going to do and how we're going to support them and things like that. I think that, one of the things that could happen is that, we look at urban sprawl is starting to happen. I mean, if you get, we're constantly moving the boundary of Little Rock, and what happens is that we're lowering density as we go along. Lowering density, it hurts small businesses. Lowering density impacts crime. It impacts schooling. It impacts, public safety as far as like fire response, police response, things like that. The more we sprawl out, the harder some of those things become. And so what we need to do is strategically plan so that way we're supporting the growth in the right way. I think we need to focus on infill, which if you're familiar with that term, great. If not, it's kind of, for anybody listening, it's kind of the idea of, okay, let's not grow outward as much as we're going to grow inward. And so we're looking at vacant lots. We have a massive amount of vacant lots. We have a list from the city that is called the uninhabitable vacant list, and it grows literally every time I pick it up. It's constantly growing. And so what we have to do is find ways to fill in those areas. And what that's going to do is it's going to naturally reduce crime without having, some of the impacts of, needing extra police force. It's going to naturally enhance education by having, more of a tax base to spend towards schools without actually having to go in and build new schools. It's going to, help a lot of areas around, and it's going to grow strategically without having the resources added on to the city. So I think that that's one of those areas where if we're going to look at growth, and we got to look at growth, we have to do it smart and wise, and we have to plan for it properly.
Well, we both have children in the city, and so that kind of brings me, I was going to go a different direction, but when you said that, I wanted to say I wanted to pull this question up. That's what I love about having conversational podcasts, is because really 8,000 is the closest number right now, nearly 8,000 vacant parcels in the city of Little Rock. And so that's where I question and I wonder, especially with respect to outside money and outside investment, like how do you feel about that? Are we unified on the idea that like outside money is also good for Little Rock, and like how do we control that kind of development like you're talking about, so that situations like Austin is a great example of like, hey, we're dealing with boilerage and blackouts because our infrastructure wasn't prepared for a rapid amount of growth in that amount of time. So how do we both avoid those kind of issues, and what sort of plans would you have to handle those vacant lots and uninhabitable properties?
Yeah, so I mean, we've actually been working. I've got one of my close advisors is also a lawyer that understands tax law very strategically. And so one of the things that you have to be aware of is that, those vacant lots and, uninhabited vacant buildings that are, in the middle of falling apart, those 9 times out of 10 are not paying any property taxes. And so what's happened is that the tax bill is racked up on them. And in order to buy those, sometimes, depending on the situation, you've got to go pay that tax bill off. And so what we're looking at is a plan to get in and waive that tax bill. This is never going to get paid. Let's be honest. It's a barrier to purchasing one of those lots. But also, we want to set a certain group of criteria to where, we want houses that are affordable. We want houses that are lived in, not just rental houses. We want houses that are, energy efficient, sustainable, things like that. And so what I think we could do is come up with a set of criteria, and that's kind of what we're working toward. If we can come up with a set of criteria where if a developer wanted to come in, purchase one of those lots, take one of those houses and rehab it, whatever, and there's great things with rehabbing houses, because you can also do historic tax credits, which help offset the price of it a lot.
Yeah, don't make me change channels to the I Hate Real Estate podcast. So.
Yes, please. But I mean, it's a lot of things that's getting in real estate's helped me learn these things. So what we can do is, I think anyway, and I've got my tax lawyers looking at it and things like that, and I think we're pretty good to go on it. It's been, I've hesitated throwing it out there yet, so you're actually the first one to hear this plan. But what I think we could do is we can say, okay, well, you go buy one of these lots, you go buy one of these houses that are falling in, rehab it, build on it, whatever we need to do to infill. And what we're going to do is we're going to waive property taxes from the city for 10 years.
Yeah, which is like, from an investment standpoint, just like personal comment, that's a great opportunity, because if they're not paying taxes on it already, you're still having to maintain it, right? So the city still has to mow these lots, right? And keep, and then go tag them and
Yeah, so it cost us city resources. Not only that, I mean, especially when you look at unsafe vacant houses, we had a big string as a couple years ago downtown. Anyway, I'm a downtowner. And of people getting in these houses, lighting fires to stay warm, and several of these properties burned down. There was, I believe, about 10 or so between the downtown and Central High district that burned down because people would get in and set fires on them because they're vacant and they knew that they're vacant. We lost like 4 or 5 just right around my house. There was over 10 of them that burned down, and it's.
And it's sad in that district too, because those are historical home districts as well.
It's sad. There's a number of them that have become drug houses. Unfortunately, there's a number of them that have, there's all kinds of activity going on in those houses. And so if you can fill those in and also get neighbors that are, and that's part of the thought process of they actually have to be inhabited by somebody living here. They can't just be like, Airbnb house where you got this constant revolving thing, because what we want to build is stronger neighborhoods through this process. So, we want people that are actually there. And what we've found in other neighborhoods is that, when people are actually there and people are involved in the neighborhood and people take ownership of the neighborhood, crime goes down dramatically. And so that's one way where we can, and there's several different ways we can reduce crime, but that's one of the main ways we can reduce crime is trying to just get more eyes and ears in the neighborhood, fill in some of these vacant lots, fill in some of these, places that are, constantly breeding crime and constantly, becoming a public safety issue.
Well, and I appreciate the sentiments towards the real estate, being something that can solve that problem. And it's interesting to hear you say that, just because there's a great example of something that happened with an outside investor here. Was he purchased an apartment complex down off of near where the substation is on Scott Street. And when he purchased that property, we had a pretty open conversation about, he said, I don't understand it. I come here to Little Rock and the property prices look like I should be investing here. Yeah. I have some concerns about X, Y, and Z, which are concerns hopefully we'll get to here in just a minute. But when we started to talk, one of the things I explained to him is like, as a real estate professional in the city at the time, I was like, I don't want you to buy this property and then stay, in your area and not do anything with it, because those dollars don't make sense for my community unless you're going to be engaged in that and build into the neighborhood. And so what's been interesting is that deal was sort of constructed around the idea that he was going to have to move here and be a part of this community. And it's been really interesting to watch that happen, because he since has moved here and become an investor and has changed a lot of the area around him by doing what you're talking about. When we spoke last night, I was speaking to him on the phone and I said, as a commercial developer, someone who came to our city, you're young, you're full of energy, you want to do this. What was the bar? Like, what kept you out? And then what also keeps you here? And he shared some of those sentiments with me. One of the things he said that spoke to me was that he felt like there were some barriers to execution with his trying to, permit this property and update this property. And so how do you feel about commercial development as overall? Is this something that we really need to start doing more of on an aggressive basis? And then speaking to that, why does it seem to be so difficult to do in the city of Little Rock?
Yeah. And I'll answer it in a roundabout way, because I think that you hit on something actually that's more important there than the actual question itself. But sorry for taking your
that's great.
Direction somewhere. But one of the things that I've found is just that I've worked with literally thousands of businesses across the state over my 20 years of doing business. And one thing that constantly comes up, if I have somebody who's done a lot of business outside the city, especially other areas of the state, and then comes into Little Rock and does business, is that Little Rock they will consistently tell me Little Rock is the hardest place to open up a business they've ever done. Part of it is that, we don't have a single point person to go to and say, okay, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Here's your checklist. Do this. We'll open up your business. You've got multiple points of contact. You've got multiple conflicting views. Sometimes you'll go to one person, they'll tell you one thing, and then the person that inspects it tells you something different, and you're delayed on inspection. I had one business that ultimately had to close down as a result of it. They were over a year behind getting open from where they wanted to. The business was ready, but just the constant changing of, requirements, constant changing of information, the constant changing of everything to do with opening up the business put them back over a year opening up. Ultimately, what that led to was they were $400,000 in the hole before they ever even got opened. Trying to overcome that is nearly impossible. And that's why, Little Rock, I think that we maintain a better rate because we're typically independently owned businesses here by and large compared to other cities. So we don't have as many closures, but the ones that do fail tend to be, they're just in too big of a hole to get started. One of the things I think we need to do is we need to streamline the approach of, hey, I want to open up a business. There needs to be a point person or two in the city where, they say, okay, well, we're going to walk you through that. We need to be very small business friendly. The big businesses figure this out and they don't care because they've got a team of people who work it through, but our small businesses don't. We need to be small business focused. So like in the case with your guy, I mean, if we would have had one point person in the city, our small business consultant or whatever you want to call it, as a part of a broader economic development committee, which several other cities in Arkansas have, that's becoming a big thing. And, cities like Austin, Chattanooga, stuff like that, they have these sort of, internal economic development bases, and they have small business consultants within them. And so really they kind of walk somebody through the process of doing it and try to speed up getting to open as fast as possible while still meeting the requirements of the city. And I think that that's something we really need to look at. I think we could easily shift resources around. I mean, the executive office, for example, has grown dramatically under, the current leadership. And I think that we could shift some of those positions over to being more of an economic driven model to where we're helping our small businesses get in, we're helping them get open. We're being pro-business as far as, especially with small businesses, to where we're trying desperately to get in with them. And then not once they're in, and this is going to be my economic development hat sliding on. One of the things we also have to do is we need to spend more of our resources toward sort of this, growth and retention. In the economic development world, it's called retention and expansion. And so the idea is that we're going to focus more on helping Apogee here continue to grow their business than we are bringing some new business in that's just going to take employees away from Apogee. If you look at what's happened to, like, say,
like they're not taking them from me. No.
But I mean, looking at economic development, and I mean, and I know this is totally different than what you were asking, so I apologize.
No, it's great because I have a perfect follow-up question for that. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So when you look at economic development, I mean, yeah, it's real sexy to say, okay, well, we brought in Amazon and they hired 1,000 new jobs. Well, whenever our unemployment rate's at 3.5, which is effectively zero, I mean, because you're never going to get down to zero. 3.5 is somewhere between 3 and 3.5 is a pretty standard, healthy unemployment rate. You're not pulling jobs for people who weren't working at that point. What you're doing is you're pulling jobs from other folks. And so, if Amazon wanted to, say, develop a tech center, what they would do is they're like, okay, well, we've got a few $1 trillion and we can sprinkle a few on Little Rock. And so what they would do is they would look at what's the average rates of, what are people getting paid at Apogee, for example, if that's what they wanted to pull from. And so they would pay them, a couple thousand more and throw them a recruitment bonus on. And so they're going to pull employees away from here to go over there and work. And then as soon as that doesn't make an economic sense for them to be located in this area, they're just going to close up because, the gain that they have over the time they're open way offsets the loss of closing up. And so, but what happens is that, a company like Apogee, well, they've just gutted us, a quarter of our employees and pulled them over there because they paid them a little bit more and gave them a sign-on bonus. And so they didn't really create any jobs. They just shifted jobs over to big business and took away from some of these small independent firms. And so if that's our business approach and if that's our city economic development approach, where we're looking at bringing in big businesses, whether it's Amazon, if it's, Topgolf, good grief, don't even get me started on that. Things like that, they're just pulling from small businesses. Yes, it's nice and sexy to say, hey, we brought in 1,000 jobs. It's not nice and sexy to say, oh, well, we helped Apogee retain all their employees and added 2 new ones. That's not as sexy, but actually that's a job growth, whereas the other one isn't.
Well, and since you did bring up Apogee, that is where we are today. We're filming here on the Unicorns premises. And what's interesting for me is that, like we talked about before the show, I was always an entrepreneur before I fell in line with this corporate company. And what's interesting about us is we are a startup that was founded here in Little Rock. And so when you talk about companies like Apogee and you talk about places like the Venture Center, many people don't realize that Little Rock is really the leader when it comes to global financial technology. And we have the accelerators that are recognized around the globe for the work that Wayne Miller and Mimi San Pedro and their team do over there. But with respect to that, when you're looking at that, how do we encourage an atmosphere of entrepreneurship like that, where you can see the end result of something like this and say, hey, that was possible to do in Little Rock? Because the truth of the matter is, like, this is kind of a unicorn. You walk in here and you think, well, how did this happen? How this happened was somebody had an incredibly good idea and was in the atmosphere and the ability to come into a city like this and create that and a culture around it that does help us go ahead. But like you said, growth and retention, that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, growth and retention is hard, but it's only hard because we make it hard. The more we focus in on entrepreneurship that's really the gold standard. We don't want to top golf here from my administration. What we want is we want to build the next top golf. It's so much more impactful to have, a business, a homegrown business, start up here, retain here, have, kind of this vested interest in the community. If you look at, even way down the line of, some of these bigger businesses here. I mean, look back to Altel, look back to Axiom. A lot of those came out of that. And it's because we, at that time, were able to foster and grow those companies. Some haven't worked out. I would say Dillard's doesn't, support, the entrepreneurial growth. But, certainly a lot of the current crop of businesses, especially in the fintech world, came out of
entrepreneurship.
Came out of that. I mean, it came out of growing Altel, which was at one point an entrepreneurship. So, I mean, it's all about planting seeds. And I think that that's what's important. And not all your seeds are going to grow. I mean, if you've ever been a gardener, you plant seeds, they don't all grow. Sometimes they get ate by squirrels, which is the case of all my tomatoes this year. But, some of them do. And when they grow, they sprout new seeds.
Right.
And so I think that that's one of the things that's important. And you also got to look at, the relationship between a company and a city. And that's something where, working across the state, especially in the manufacturing world, we saw a lot. You have companies like Whirlpool, for example. So we did a lot of work back with Whirlpool in Fort Smith. And whenever they left that city, because they weren't vested, I mean, they were vested, but only to a certain degree. They were only vested to the point where it made financial sense for them in Fort Smith. When they left, it killed half the workforce there. I mean, it really impacted that city hard. Versus because what they had was they had workers there. They had people who were trained on a certain process, putting a certain thing together, and they never fostered that group. They never grew them because their headquarters weren't there. Why would they? They're going to move them to the headquarters. Whereas you look at Altel, they had people who started off on the bottom floor, but this was the headquarters. And so we're constantly growing and training and introducing them to new ideas. And a lot of them float off and do their own thing. And that's really cool. And that really helps our city. If the comparison we get all the time is Northwest Arkansas, and they're like, oh, well, we don't have Walton money. I'm like, no, but we have the opportunity to create Walton money. There's no reason why we don't. We just got to invest in the small businesses that are here, help them grow to the point where we do have 10 Walton monies.
Hi, I'm Jamie Taylor, host of the Block Talk podcast. These mayoral interviews wouldn't have been possible without the gracious support of our sponsor. When you build a property with Mike Orndorff Properties, what you can expect is development done differently. This is a developer who connects people to their places and creates a space where you can live simply. If you want more information, check them out on Facebook. Yeah, it's funny that you just said that too, because you're going to have to hold back that's I just want to go off when I hear that too, because Central Arkansas has so much to offer. And we do have things like Apogee that come out of here, and we're able to grow them because there are the opportunities and advantages of growing in the Central Arkansas area. We have a very low median home price. We have the ability for people to come and be a part of more walkable communities. What's going on in Petaway and Soma is very beautiful. We have these opportunities to attract and maintain and retain people and talent who want to be a part of an infrastructure in a city that's looking to grow and expand over the next several years. But I just continue to say that, we are the last, in my opinion, mid-sized city in the United States that has all of this potential for growth, and we haven't maxed ourselves out of our price range either when it comes to style of living and everything. So when it comes down to that, one of the other things I want to know about is public and private partnerships, because it's very important, in my opinion anyways, that they further expand the city of Little Rock. So as it relates to public-private partnerships, what are your feelings on that? Do we need to do more of it, less of it, and how does it engage your city to grow?
I think asking if we need to do more of it would be thinking that we actually do any of it at all, which is not the case. So let's be real clear there. I mean, realistically, yeah. I mean, so we need, it's not just about the money. It is about the money, but it's not just about the money. I mean, it's about having, these companies like an Apogee or, like an Altel back in the day, take ownership in the city. I mean, it allows them to say, we got some pride here, and here's where we planted that pride. Here's where, we help this area at. Here's where we continue to grow our city. And I think that has to happen. Yes, we don't have the budget to handle everything we need right now. We've got a huge investment needed for parks right now. We have a huge investment needed for infrastructure right now. We have a huge investment needed for all kinds of areas, and we just simply don't have the money. I mean, if you're looking at the city budget, it's just not there. I mean, for the areas that we need to grow, it's not there right now. But leveraging some of these public-private partnerships is a nice way to close that gap. But more than that, it helps them have a stake in the city and helps them, firmly plant themselves here. I think, the fintech world, yes, but I mean, also look at what's going on in banking. I mean, you have Bank OZK building huge headquarters, Simmons making, really their move here and making Little Rock their home. I mean, there's so much. And then you've got kind of the balance between the two. Yeah, we got great fintech and we got great financing. I mean, it's really fascinating what's happening in Little Rock, and we can be sort of that hub for it. But we need to make sure that we keep them there. I mean, Simmons just acquired a huge thing out of Dallas. They've also got huge investments in Florida and other places. We need to make sure that Little Rock is their home and their roots are firmly planted here. And one of the ways to do that is through public-private partnerships. But I mean, also, too, it benefits them to have this type of stuff. I still recall early on in my, getting into restaurant world, I had a meeting up in Bentonville and was talking to some of the folks who, later, were representing the Waltons and representing, their huge cash flow that they've ended up spending up there. And they were like, yeah, we want to make Bentonville a cool town, and we want to like do this and we want to do that. We want to really breed this nice culture. And I was like, why? That doesn't make any sense. This is Bentonville. Have you looked around? I mean, at the time, there was nothing at all. I mean, Bentonville was kind of a dead town at the time. And they're like, well, because what we're doing is we're losing out to anytime we bring in, somebody we're trying to hire, some big executive who has bright ideas and a bright future, what we're losing out to is we're losing out to the Southern Cows. We're losing out to Austin. We're losing out to places where there's this culture and they don't necessarily care about the job. And it's a big difference in economic development. People who are smart and talented are less concerned about the job than they are about where they live and where they're going to grow up and the culture around the city. And so I think that that's one of those things where investing in these public-private partnerships and trying to actively form them and trying to actively cultivate them and grow them helps them attract new employees too, because then they can say, okay, well, look at this beautiful park that's over here by our campus. Look at, say it's Apogee and we want to invest in the river trail. I mean, and
we do. We invest. Our bikes are back here, actually parked right there.
Yeah, and beef that. But I mean, what would happen if this grew into being, a multi-billion-dollar company and they wanted to invest, $1 billion or $2 billion in this trail? And can you imagine how awesome that would be? And then they can bring in a new recruit here and say, look, we helped with this. We're invested in this community. This is a cool place to live because we helped make it a cool place to live.
Right.
The value of the company is going to skyrocket at that point. And so it's important to invest in that. And then it's just this loop where we're always, we're growing a company, they're investing, they're growing some more, they're investing, they're growing some more. And it creates this cool loop to where, we all of a sudden have this thriving city that looks a lot like an Austin, looks a lot like a Chattanooga, things like that. And there's absolutely no reason why Little Rock cannot look like those
great American cities.
I mean,
right?
There's no reason at all. I mean, we have everything we need here. It's just a matter of cultivating it correctly.
Right. Just kind of rearranging it. And it's interesting because you kind of touch on culture, and that makes me think about the citizenry and like how Little Rock is. And when you live here in Little Rock and you're not familiar, if you don't live here, if you're not familiar with the way it works, like when COVID hit, one of my favorite stories from that was we have a mutual friend that owns a coffee shop downtown on the corner. And it was just
almost stopped there this morning. We went to Fidel instead.
Yeah, but the thing is you have a wide range of locally owned coffee shops that brew great coffee. So you're good to go. But what's interesting is on that corner, what I noticed when COVID hit and restaurants were having a really hard time is that people were running around buying gift cards from those local companies to make sure that they were sustained through that process. And so as I saw that happen, I thought, well, this is supposed to be a big capital city, but it's really a small town where everybody's had each other's back and kind of worked through our challenges as small business owners and community influencers. And so with respect to that, how do we unify a culture and a community? And especially in today's times where sometimes things are sensitive or difficult to talk about, it feels like when you live here and you're part of the fabric, yeah, it's a great place to live. The people are wonderful. But if you're an outsider looking in and you see some of the issues we're facing, how do we unify our city and our culture when it just comes to the feeling and the vibe? Hey, I'm from Central Arkansas.
Yeah, I think a lot of what's happened, and not to be overly political, but I mean, I think a lot of what's happened is that we've got a big divide right now in Little Rock. I mean, even if you look at, not trying to bash anybody because that's really not my style. But if you look at the other two candidates, I mean, you have one candidate saying, oh, well, I want this to grow. And then you got the other candidate saying, I want the complete opposite to grow. And I mean, really what we need is those ideas to merge in together. We need to say, okay, we want to grow the whole city. Yes, we've got to start with the parts that have been historically neglected first. I mean, if we're being real honest, I mean, Little Rock from the very foundation of Little Rock, we've had parts of the city that have been historically underserved, historically neglected, things like that. We've got to rise from the bottom. We can't just keep topping off. We've got to start filling up from the bottom some. And so, yes, we need to shift finances and resources to help grow some of those, communities, help grow some of the areas that have been just very historically underserved. And they've got to be at a higher rate than what some of the areas that have been historically prosperous get. And that's, a complicated conversation, and nobody ever really likes that conversation, but it really is the truth. So I think that, we've got to work on, building up from the bottom first, but then also at the same time trying to bridge gaps. The problem is that Little Rock has a history of continuing divides, and we do it both physically and, just mentally. But physically, we've got to stop that too. We've got to stop. I'm a big, how do I say this nicely? I don't like what we've allowed groups like RDOT to come in and do, the Arkansas Department of Transportation, because what they've done is they've continuously widened the physical gap between the areas of the city. If you look at what they've done on 630, 630 in the beginning is terrible. What they're doing now on 30, it's creating an even larger divide there. And so what we've got to do is we've got to both mentally and physically bridge those divides. And so I think that there's some growing sentiment, especially some of us that live downtown, that, we've got to stop this continuous expansion. Otherwise, we're going to have a gulf between the areas of the city that's really too wide to divide. And so I think that that's a lot of it too. We've got to start fighting back against Department of Transportation, start trying to tear down some of that, and then start working on crossing culture a little bit. Start working on, let's get people to, I'm a big believer in, we spend a whole lot of money from the AMP Commission, which is advertising promotion. So basically we take 2% off of hotel visits and any restaurants we eat at. And then what that's supposed to do is supposed to go back to promote other restaurants and other hotels in the city to encourage development. What that typically means is that we're spending a whole lot of money on Robinson, which is a point of contention. What I'd love to see is us focus on this. Let's build a campaign of this sort of internal tourism. Let's get people from West Little Rock to go downtown. Let's get people from downtown to go to Southwest. Let's get this cross traffic going on, and let's work on doing this sort of internal tourism idea where we get people going to other areas of the city. Because, what happens is if you're living, way out in West Little Rock, and this is part of the messaging points that I don't agree with some of my other candidates, some of my other opponents, is that, we can't be scared of our city. We can't have people from West Little Rock scared to go downtown, because it's not a scary place. I live downtown. It is not scary. I've never once felt unsafe. There's crime, yes, but we can work on preventing that. But even whenever there's not crime, people are still scared to go downtown. So we've got to work on getting people to get out and mix a little bit more and see other areas of the city.
Well, and it's interesting that you brought it up in that way, because when I think about like the original effects of redlining and the original infrastructure and the way the freeways were built and all those things, like there is a lot of misunderstanding in how that can be rectified and how neighborhoods can change. Like if you don't have a lot of economic understanding, it really starts with like the school in the neighborhood, and then it starts with the resources in the neighborhood and the ability to have a happy, good quality of life in different areas of the city. Typically, and this one is really close to home for me. Anyone that knows me personally knows I spend a lot of time in the southwest area of the city. Spend a lot of time in each area of the city, to be totally honest. And what really gets me is what you're saying. Some people will say like, hey, I don't want to go to that area of town. I'm not interested in investing in that area of town. For me, in total and truth and honesty, I did not speak a word of Spanish 3 years ago. I didn't have any real true interest or investment in that area of the community until I saw what was going on there. And what I saw was a huge portion of our workforce, a vibrant community with a lot to say. And I also noticed that there was a real lack of resources when it came to, and not trashing anybody either, but when it came down to the city, the Chamber of Commerce, the Conventions Bureau, there's all these different places where you're supposed to be able to go as a small business who is taxed and licensed through the city, but they don't have resources in your language. And so in order to be an inclusive community and make everyone feel included, like what is your administration's plan or your plan to be able to unify that message and say, look, if you want to live here in Little Rock, you can speak Spanish or English or Vietnamese. It doesn't matter. We're going to find a way to get you the resources you need to feel at home here in Little Rock. Yeah,
certainly. And I think it helps to look at some historic context of this. In 2010, the 2010 census, we had roughly about 6% Hispanic. In 2020, we were up over 10. If you go way back to 2000, we were down around 3%. So what's happening effectively is we're doubling the Hispanic population every single census year, every 10 years. And so I think a lot of it is that, I mean, you've also got city directors that have been in there for 30 years. And so when they got into office, the Hispanic population was, 1.5%, something like that. I don't think that they've understood essentially how much that population has grown and how important it is to the city. If it keeps growing at this rate, I mean, the Hispanic population will be a considerable size of the city. And so, yeah, we have to make sure that we have resources. Have to make sure that we have the right attitude toward the Hispanic population. They're not marginalized. We can't do that. They're not a small fraction of the population anymore. They're a sizable portion of the population. And so we have to make sure that we understand that, and we have to readjust our attitudes toward the Hispanic community. I don't speak Spanish either. My wife gives me a hard time all the time because I failed Spanish in college because but I mean, that doesn't matter. I mean, just because, we don't speak Spanish. And I think that's a lot of what's going on is that, as a city director right now, you don't speak Spanish. You're not Spanish yourself. As a mayor, you don't speak Spanish. You're not Spanish yourself. It's easy to not think about those people who do because they're not like you. I think that's a little bit getting outside of your comfort zone. You have to make sure that, hey, I'm going in those areas where these people, they don't speak the same language as me. They're not like me, but they're still people of Little Rock, and they're still citizens of Little Rock. And we have to make sure that we're taking care of them just as much as we are everybody else.
Well, and that's where I just got kind of like goosebumpy when you said that, though, because that's one of the things that really I do now, in the sense that I didn't know how to make those connections either. And so I found myself, a friend of mine was like, well, just go to the mercados, go to the grocery store, check out, try to figure it out. And so the more and more I explored through that town, I realized that barrier of language, really just a couple words, just the effort to try, just being there, that whole community responded back to me with love and open arms. And hey, we do want to be part of this city, and have just answered the call at every turn to continue to build businesses and grow themselves. And so I guess what I really seem to understand about the differences between different communities, not just the Hispanic community, but everybody who lives in Little Rock, is there's kind of seems to be a lack of good communication, or maybe miscommunication between what the expectations are with our code enforcement and our city officers and the people that are out there looking at those properties, and the people that own them and or rent them. And so talk to me a little bit about, how do we communicate effectively with everybody across the board, with code enforcement, with the city, how you're supposed to maintain your home, what the rules and laws are about that? How do you sort of unify that approach and that message to our residents to make sure everyone's on the same page and has the same understanding?
Yeah. And so I think first and foremost, it needs to be said, there's some really good code enforcement officers out there. There's some really good police officers out there. There's really good people in every group that try to take a more community-oriented approach. But sadly, I think overall as a group, I mean, when you see a code officer, you think, oh, I'm getting a ticket for something. They're writing me up for some code violation. And I actually, oddly enough, for the weirdest 6 months of my life, was a code officer at one point. So not for the city of Little Rock. But I mean, I understand what they go through. And I mean, so you're being being told, okay, well, take action on this, let's do this, let's do that, and it's always action oriented. It's the same thing with the police force. I mean, police in its traditional sense is going out and enforcing crimes, or enforcing, violations of crime. So, I mean, if somebody, whether it's a speeding ticket, I mean, your interaction with the police is because you were going too fast. If it's a, arrest, you've done something against the law, that's your interaction with the police force. What we've got to do is we got to change our interactions. It's not about, just going out and enforcing. And that's, whether it's a code officer who is enforcing violations, or if it's a police officer who is enforcing, violations, we have to take a different approach and get out there and get to know the community. I think that it's just a matter of, we have to take this community-oriented approach in everything that we do, not just those two specific categories. We've got to get out there, meet with the community, talk with them. I mean, my dream would be for, police to roll up and kids come, running to them, seeing what's going on, things like that. Not everybody running away scared. Same thing with code. I mean, it's like, I've got a couple code officers who I know get out and they have their territories, and they get out and they walk and they talk to the neighbors and things like that. They're really involved with the community aspect of it. And I think that that's what's needed. I think we need to reward those officers who are taking that community-oriented approach. We need to redefine how we measure officers. It's not just about, hey, here's how many arrests you had, here's how many tickets you wrote, things like that. It's, okay, well, did you talk to this many people in the community
how many lives
today?
did you impact, right?
Yeah, how many people did you actually impact? It's a lot about metrics. That's one of the things, again, I worked for, it was a partnership with ADC. I worked at Windrock International, but it was just a grant project for me. But I worked under ADC. I worked under, a National Institute of Manufacturing. And so we had metrics we had to report. And what happens is the way you handle your job is based on the metrics you have to report. And so if we can change those metrics, we can change the way our officers, the way our community,
My son's trying to do that right now at Catholic High as a freshman, and he's trying to get them to change the criteria in which they grade his homework, because that way it'd be easier. But so far his campaign is not going well. So
probably not.
You're doing better than he is. But that being said, you brought up the police. And so moving from code enforcement and sort of the delivery and the messaging into the police, I actually have a friend who's a lieutenant with the police department who speaks Spanish, is bilingual, and kind of is one of those police officers who really sets an example. He's engaged with his community. But one of the things we discussed recently was that we do have a steady decline in the number of officers who are interested in working for the police department. We have some differently constructed police departments in neighborhoods in different cities around us, North Little Rock to be one to look at. With the conditions that are present in the Little Rock Police Department, how do we handle that and deal with it? Because there seems to be a lot of controversy based on every different candidate's position as it relates to Little Rock crime and police. So let's just get your view and kind of position on all that.
Yeah, I think the first question to ask is, why would you be a Little Rock police officer? What would make you become a Little Rock police officer? If you look at it on the surface, we've got. He's gone now, but we had a chief who was suing the police department, a police department that was suing the chief, different fractions within it. They all seem like they don't like each other very much. You're underpaid, understaffed. Why would you become a Little Rock police officer? We've got to start changing that conversation. We got to start changing it to be, why wouldn't you be a Little Rock police officer? We have this unified idea, and we're all going in the same direction. We're all helping people rather than, arresting people. We're all trying to do a job together, and we're supporting each other. We know the mayor's got our back. We know the city council's got our back. We know those things happen. Why wouldn't you be? And that's kind of the conversation we have to have, because right now it's why would you be? And that's the conversation North Little Rock's having with us, the state police are having with us, Capitol Police are having with us, is they're going in and talking to our Little Rock police officers like, why are you still there? And that's part of the conversation we had to change. We got to bridge some of these gaps that are happening right now.
Well, in a state of emergency is a scary place to be. And we've been there with relation to education. We've been there with relation to crime. And so as a city, we've really had to combat some of those two. But those are the two biggest issues when you're talking to somebody outside. Somebody like myself who moves here from Southern California, you're like, hey, what are your biggest concerns as a parent, as a professional? If you're looking at those things and you don't live here, you don't have that understanding of like, yes, you can walk down the street. It sounds so much different than it is. However, when I think about that, I think about when I grew up, I looked at policing differently than I do as an adult. And sure, there's a lot of nuances and things in that conversation to be had. But at the end of the day, what it used to be is a revered position within the community where these people solve problems for you. And I don't know about you, but like when I had a big seizure or when I get in a car accident, like I don't call my mom, I call 911, So these people are dealing with more than just police issues. They're dealing with car accidents and traffic citations and all of those things. And so I think it's an overreaching subject that's really going to have to be talked about a lot the more that this race goes on, to figure out how do we do that collectively, get people excited on board. Yeah.
And there's two problems right now. And we've got to solve both of them at the same time, which is incredibly difficult. Well, really three problems, but it all boils down to two problems. Yes, we do. And we have to admit that we do have a crime issue right now. When crime is so high, it impacts other areas like that. It impacts response time on accidents. It impacts, every other police activity. When they're having to respond to so many crimes, especially when you're short-staffed, you're, pulling, sometimes, 14, 15-hour shifts, things like that are happening right now in the police department. So we have to address the immediacy of the problem, and we have to fill those positions. We have to try to find a way to reduce crime. Another one of the areas that I've talked about a lot, but I don't hear anybody else talking about is, 911 and non-emergency services. A lot of times those phones are going unanswered, and there's been a lot of excuses from the city, but they're going unanswered. Let's just be real honest about it. So if you were in an accident and wanted to call 911 right now, there's a good chance you wouldn't get through. So you're going to have to sit there for a while until you can finally get through. Where it really comes into play is okay, so, let's say there's been a lot of shootings at gas stations, for instance. Let's say I'm a gas station owner and I see, a couple out there getting into an argument, which is how most of these gas station shootings have started. And I try to call 911, which several of them have, and they don't get through. Or I try to call the non-emergency number and they don't get through. That crime escalates from being, a non-violent or a non-crime whatsoever to all of a sudden being a violent crime. And so this escalation that's happening because a lot of times our numbers just aren't going through. They're not being answered. And so we see an escalation in crime, and the numbers support that because if you look at our numbers, our nonviolent crime is actually down considerably, but our violent crime is super high. And so what that tells me is that nonviolent crime is escalating to the point of violence a lot of times. So we've got to look at that. But the other thing is this long-term approach. The fact is that Little Rock gets into this cycle about every 10 to 15 years, we'll have a crime bubble like we're having right now. It happened during the 90s. That's very famous. It also happened during the 2000s. I mean, it happens about every 10 to 15 years. We have this cycle of crime. And the problem is that we always want to address the immediacy of the crime and try to reduce that, but we don't ever do anything to reduce the long-term cycle of the crime and some of these broader problems that happen. I mean, the reality is that kids don't have anything to do after school. They don't have, the parks are bad, so they don't have anywhere to go to actually get rid of some energy on the weekends. We don't have after school tutoring. Little Rock School District has declined considerably over the past 20 years. To whereas whenever I was going to high school, I mean, Central High was like this fantastic, amazing school. Little Rock School District was constantly rated one of the best in the nation. Now it's in the bottom 20% in the state a lot of times, depending on the school. So we have to work on reinvesting in schools too. We have to work on reinvesting in community initiatives to get kids, give them an option. I mean, if they don't have any other option, then yeah, they're going to get, brought into areas of crime by older kids, and we have to give them some kind of option. We have to plant these seeds for long term. Otherwise, that 10 or 15 year cycle, if you think about it, that's just a new generation of kids coming up who didn't know any better, and they're getting pulled into crime activities.
Well, and it's so interesting too, because one of the things that, one of the most fundamental roles of government is for us to feel safe as a community, right? And that's it. When you look at that, I'm hoping that every administration, every candidate that's running is keeping front of mind, like, hey, we want to have that feeling as an overreaching feeling in Little Rock. Yes, we're safe, but you just brought up a very good point of the intricacy and in the intertwined nature of crime and education. And I think you probably know this, and it's kind of a well-known fact that prison systems are really built around the level of reading attributed with a certain grade level. And so when you look at that, what it speaks to me as a parent is that most of the time, and I think this also goes back to neighborhoods, so forgive me for kind of adding it all together, but when it comes to the health of a person, when a desperate person is in a desperate situation, they are oftentimes going to make a desperate decision. And so if they don't have the opportunity to learn better and to do better, then you put them in a position like, how do I move forward? And so with respect to that, knowing the number of children we have that are drug addicted, I think we're 48th in the country when it comes to teacher pay. How do we invigorate people to get engaged with our education system, to devote themselves to those professions that oftentimes feel like they're not rewarding financially, but can impact and change a whole entire city and generation of children.
Yeah. And I mean, certainly from a city perspective, it's really, really hard to impact things like teacher pay, along with the conversation we're having about property and trying to incentivize infill. The other thing we're having about is this sort of tax incentive for folks like teachers. I mean, we can't as a city give teachers any more money. What we can do is reduce the amount of money we have to take. And so that's one thing where, we're looking at exploring is some kind of grant program to where we can waive property taxes. Because if you're a teacher, you're essentially paying your own salary. I mean, you're paying in property taxes that goes back to pay your salary. So what we're looking at doing, which is...
Well, and that's also I know a lot of teachers who shout out to those teachers who I see all the time at soccer, they are... buying a lot of their own supplies.
They are
sort of entrepreneurs.
They kind of are. Yeah. And so, it's one of those areas where I think that we can look at, okay, we can incentivize, because the other thing, we want those teachers to be involved in Little Rock. We want them to be a part of Little Rock.
They don't have time, Greg.
They don't have time. No, they don't have time. But the reality is that, teacher's job never stops. It never ends. Regardless if you're, an LRSD teacher living here, or if you're living in North Little Rock or Cabot or wherever, your job is still ongoing. We want to make sure that they're choosing Little Rock. And so what we're looking at doing is and and again, I can't control other communities. I can control Little Rock. And so what we're looking at doing is, waiving, creating a grant program where we can waive property taxes for teachers. I think that would help incentivize living here because, again, we don't have control over anybody else. We can incentivize living here and being a teacher here. And so I think that's one area we can look at. We can look at, again, with these public-private partnerships, let's look at creating a pool of classroom supplies where teachers can just go and shop and get what they need. Get what they need. I mean, that would be a great public-private partnership. I think we have the private entities here that we could pull that off. I think that there's things like that we have to be. It's real easy to say, we can't impact teacher pay. We can't impact, the quality of life for teachers, but we can. Mm-hmm. We just got to be a little bit creative about it.
Well, and it goes back to like what you just said. I mean, what a brilliant idea as far as like, if I'm a teacher and I get a tax incentive to live in the neighborhood where my school is, then obviously I'm going to be closer to my school. I'm going to be more engaged with my school. And so is the neighborhood around me. So that's exciting to think about. So if you had a magic wand, like what if you did? What if I handed you a magic wand and I said, okay, Greg, you can change anything, any code, any rule in the city. You can add to it, subtract it, or just voila, change it. What would you pick from all the many things that you could change and just go, boop, I want that to change right now? What would you pick?
Man, that is a heck of a question, and one that I've been thinking on for the whole time since I saw that question. And
me too.
There's so many areas I don't have a good answer to it. I mean, yes, I would love to, be able to impact things like teacher pay. I would love to be able to impact, a ton of other things. What I think it boils down to is that really and truly, and you saw this real hard during COVID, the city of Little Rock is still so much under the jurisdiction of the state. The state controls a lot of what a mayor can and cannot do. It controls a lot of what a municipality can and cannot do. And that relationship, I mean, and there's always this back and forth of, during COVID, for example, we wanted to do a mask policy. Our glorious Republican legislator, and if you can't see me, I'm rolling my eyes on that one, that tried to restrict every ounce of things like that from the power of, local entities, which is hilarious because they're built on giving local support and giving local rights. They restricted the city of Little Rock from being able to enact any kind of mask policy. They restricted us from doing all kinds of things. Ideally, I would love to create more power for municipalities to actually control what goes on in their city. And this is not just about the Republican legislator. They're just the most recent ones to enforce that. I mean, that goes back to whenever it was a Democratic legislator. It goes back even further than that. We as a state constantly restrict what the cities can do, restrict how they can govern themselves. And ideally, I'd love to see that needle moved a little further to where, we can do what's best for us because our community is different than everybody else. Like I said, our form of government's a crazy mess compared to everything else. It's totally different. It's a bit of a unicorn in and of itself.
Yeah. What's interesting about that is I didn't know up until I was starting to do these more mayoral candidate races 4 years ago. I didn't know that was the structure of Little Rock. And so as I was sitting across from candidates trying to figure out what they were going to do when they became mayor, I was thinking, well, it'd be important if I knew how this ran. And so I thought maybe other people should know that too, because it is an interesting model. It's not something you see a lot in other cities.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, even the ability for us to change that requires several hoops for us to jump through. Some involving state to be able to change the form of government for what fits us best. I think that, waving the magic wand of saying, okay, well, let's move this needle on what us as a city and what other cities across, because I also talked to other city leaders across the state, what can we do as a city to impact our community for what's best for us, not just what's best for the state as a whole, because, we're different than Fayetteville. Fayetteville's different than us. Springdale's way different than everybody. Bentonville's different. Benton's different. El Dorado's different. We're all different. And we all have different needs in our community. We all have different dynamics that happen. But we're kind of bound by this overarching, state rule that, doesn't allow us to make too many changes to our own citizenry and to our own municipality of what's best for us individually.
Yeah, that's a good point and a great answer to the question. And so as we start to wrap up, I'm going to bring a little fun to the table because we've been talking about very serious matters. And for the record, we did make it into the Chris Stapleton Arkansas song, and I think it was for barbecue. So that probably shouts out to the vein of good reviews on barbecue food. But anyway,
I have no clue what you're talking about right now.
So Chris Stapleton, have you not heard this song? Has a song called Arkansas. And if you listen to it on your way home, he says, I stop in Little Rock on the way home to get some barbecue. And so it's like that was the thing that he claimed he picked all these different areas like going through the Ozark Mountains and sitting on top of the world. And then he's like in some barbecue. And I think he was talking about Sim's. So it's pretty cool. Or Slim's barbecue down on their new location. So anyways, I say that to say, what's your favorite place? And I know you have a lot of people in the restaurant industry, so I'm not going to ask you to specifically pick out somebody's name. But of food, if you had to choose and you're coming to Little Rock for the very first time and you got to send somebody to your favorite restaurant for an out-of-towner to try in Little Rock, what would you choose?
Man, that is a great question. And I get asked like, what's my favorite restaurant constantly? And it's like one of those, well, I mean, if it's, I mean, the reality is it's, what are you looking for? I think there's a lot of places that do some great things. Two people, and I'll narrow this down to two for you because that's the best I can do. I think the question is what's unique? I mean, what can we do that's unique where you just can't find anywhere else? And so I think of two places a lot of times with that. And I mean, there's tons of other places that I love. Sim's is one of them. They're right down the road from my house. I love running down there. Mm-hmm. Love Sim's to death. We've got Table 28 with Chef Scott Rains and Chow Bachi with Jeffrey Owen. And so what I like about what I love about both of them, and I think what's unique about them and what's uniquely Little Rock about them, which is what I think has to be the ultimate. I mean, we can't just say, okay, well, yeah, we do a good job on this, but you can go find it somewhere else better. I don't think you can find what they do better anywhere else. And I think that's what's unique about it. If you've never had the chance, it's going to run you some money, but if you never had the chance, call Scott Rains, 2 weeks in advance, give him a little bit of time because the more time you give him, the better he is. And say, hey, I just want you to throw me together a dinner. I don't care what it is. I want a tasting menu. Just do whatever. Scott's really great in taking cuts of protein that are in a unique way, unique cuts of protein that you maybe not had before, things like that. It's just an overall creative approach, and he's a brilliant chef. Jeffrey Owen's kind of the opposite. I mean, he takes, kind of standard cuts of protein, standard, dishes, and elevates them to a new level. And I think that's great. I love going. I drive my wife crazy because we go into these places and I'm always ordering tasting menus just because I just want the chef to bring me out whatever it is. I think those two do a great job both on their tasting menus. So it's fabulous.
Well, it's funny because that's actually a lot of times people that go to restaurants with me laugh because the person comes to the table. They're like, what do you want? I'm like, you work here. You tell me what I want. You have to eat the same thing every day. So you're going to know what's the best thing here at this restaurant. So
yeah, if there's a tasting menu, I'm ordering it. We went to Vegas for our 15th anniversary.
Congratulations.
So, and that was, we didn't the goal was not to gamble at all or anything. We just wanted to go eat. I mean, that was everywhere we went and ate. I was like, let's just get a tasting menu.
Yeah.
My wife just rolls her eyes. She's like, what if I don't like it? And I'm like, good. Then you got to try something new.
Yeah. Well, that was fun because I moved here from Las Vegas, and I will tell you that I didn't expect the food scene to be as amazing and incredible as it is. And over time, it gets better and better and richer and richer. And so it's really cool to see and be part of. And if you haven't taken the Little Rock food tour and you're listening in for the first time, come to Little Rock. We could definitely show you some good places to eat.
Yeah. And I mean, speaking of Vegas, I mean, and I know you're trying to wrap up here. I mean, one of the cool things is that, I mean, so we went to Bizarre Meat by Jose Andreas. The Little Rock connections there are unbelievable. Really? I mean, there's so many people who came through that organization that have been working with Jose, and there's plenty of people here in Little Rock still working with Jose.
Wait, at World Central Kitchen?
Yeah.
Because he works with Kyle and Scott.
And and Kyle's doing all kinds of amazing things. Yes. We just sat down a few weeks ago to Kyle Pounders, who does Excalibur, and he's got these crazy cool entrepreneurial ideas that he's trying to plan and coming.
Don't worry, we won't say anything on air. It's really good.
Yeah, but it's really cool, and I think that it's creative enough to be amazing and move the needle forward, but not so much that it's just a wild hair that's never going to get implemented. And I think that's always the balance with entrepreneurship, is trying to find, an idea that moves us forward, but not so wild that it's never going to get implemented. And I think that's, being an entrepreneur myself, I've gone way far off on the deep end on one of those, and it doesn't work out very well. So
yeah, well, I can relate. So I've been there before, and I'm super grateful to have you on the show. It's been exciting to see you step out and take this opportunity as your own, grab the bull by the horns. I'm excited to watch the rest of the race, and I'll be staying in tune and watching you kind of take each one as it comes and see how this turns out. If you do end up winning, just give me a shout and I'll tell you all the things that I want to do. No, I'm just kidding.
No, please. I mean, and that's
suggestions are welcome, right?
That's one of those things where I think that as a leader, you have to be open to suggestions. You have to have an open mind. I think if you just surround yourself with people who think the same way as you, you're never going to move anything forward. So I think that, part of it is reaching out and taking ideas that, maybe I would listen to you anyway, but I mean, maybe I wouldn't, listen to you and hearing you and taking into account. It may not mean that I'm going to do everything you want, but I think being informed how other people think and stepping outside your bounds, it was, kind of back to the earlier question about how do we bridge this cultural divide. And I think a lot of it is just stepping outside your comfort zone
Yep.
and listening to people who aren't you, don't look like you, don't act like you, don't think like you, don't have the same background as you. And honestly setting and hearing what their ideas are and taking it to heart, and not just, looking at your phone the whole time while you're talking to them or something like that. You actually got to listen.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, I've been listening to you and I bet your phone's been blowing up. So real quickly before we get off air, would you do me a favor and let the voters know where they can get more information about your campaign and where they can find and try to connect with you if they're wanting to?
Yeah. Get on Facebook, Twitter, look up Greg Henderson. I'm there on both of them. You can go to jgreghenderson.com. J is my first name, so we're not gonna get it too much into that, but it's the domain I can get. So got all the information there. I've got several talking points, but also, shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions. Shoot me a Facebook message. My email is greg@rockcityeats.com. Real simple to remember. I'm not going to give up my phone number here, but it's not hard to find either. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer questions. I really am. I want to be an open and approachable candidate.
Perfect. Well, you heard it here first on the Block Talk. I am Jamie Taylor and here with Greg Henderson for the first of 3 mayoral podcast episodes that you'll see over the coming weeks. So get out there and vote. If you need more information on Greg and his campaign, you can reach out on his website or reach out to us here on the Block Talk. We'll be happy to connect you. Greg, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Jamie.
Little Rock, we're out.